So imagine waking up tomorrow morning, right? And your entire reality has just completely shifted.
Oh, wow. Okay, like in what way?
Well, I don't mean like your house is different or, your job has changed. I mean the very way you perceive time or the way you interact with your closest friends,
Right.
even the way you process your own internal emotions. Imagine if all of it is suddenly and entirely dictated by the grammatical rules of the language you are forced to speak.
That is, I mean, it honestly sounds like some kind of thought experiment from a science fiction novel, you know?
Yes, exactly.
The idea that a language isn't just like a neutral tool we use to describe the world, but rather an invisible architecture that actually builds the world around us while we use it.
Right. But the crazy thing is, you don't actually have to imagine this world because it already exists.
Yeah, it really does.
It is spoken by over 600 million people right now. And today, we're doing a deep dive into a huge mountain of historical, acoustic, and linguistic research on the Spanish language. We're going to explore the cognitive and cultural architecture of Spanish, looking at it not just as a method of communication, but as a completely distinct way of, seeing, feeling, and categorizing the world.
Yeah, and the mission for you, the listener, as we go through this material today is to completely move beyond, like, vocabulary lists.
Oh, absolutely. Forget the high school flashcards.
Right, forget the verb conjugation charts. We want to really understand what the research refers to as the mental world simulation of Spanish.
The mental world simulation. I love that phrase.
That's great, right? Our goal today is to discover exactly how a very specific history, a specific set of sounds, and a totally unique syntax all combine over centuries.
To basically create a language that is fundamentally expressive, deeply relational, and, well, incredibly emotionally vibrant.
Exactly. We are trying to figure out what it actually feels like to live inside this language and how it shapes the human brain.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I think there's a huge temptation to just look at a dictionary and assume that languages are basically just different codes for the exact same human experience.
Oh, for sure. That's a very common misconception.
But the research makes it incredibly clear that to understand the psychology of Spanish, we really have to look at the dirt it grew out of, right? Like a language's history is the foundation of its modern psychology.
It is the ultimate foundation. I mean, you literally can't separate the two. And the history of Spanish is essentially a story of relentless layering and collision.
Layering and collision.
Yeah. I mean, it is a Romance language, which means its root system is Latin. But we have to be really specific here.
Right, because we're not talking about guys in togas giving fancy speeches.
Exactly. This was not the high-polished literary Latin of senators and poets in Rome delivering carefully crafted arguments. We are talking about Vulgar Latin.
The language of the soldiers.
Yes. The soldiers, the merchants, the regular people actually walking the streets of the Iberian Peninsula after the Romans arrived around 200 BC.
So the boots on the ground language.
Exactly that.
Right.
It was practical, it was spoken, and honestly, it was already mutating the moment it left the Italian peninsula,
Right.
and that became the baseline. But the development of this language on the Iberian Peninsula was shaped by these massive, just huge historical upheavals.
Because the Roman Empire eventually collapses, right?
Right. And you don't just get a straight line from Rome to modern Madrid, you get centuries of Germanic rule, primarily the Visigoths, who sort of swooped down into the peninsula.
And looking at the notes here, the Visigoths didn't completely overwrite the Latin, right? But they left a very specific linguistic footprint.
They did.
Mostly words related to war, armor, and conquest. Words like guerra for war or llamo for helmet.
Yeah, precisely.
So you have this Latin foundation that is suddenly militarized by a Germanic overlay.
That's a really great way to put it.
Yeah.
But the massive tectonic shift, like the event that truly separates the destiny of Spanish from something like French or Italian, that happens in the early 8th century.
Right. The notes highlight the year 711 AD.
Yes, 711 AD. This is the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula.
Which fundamentally rewrites the DNA of the whole region.
It does. It completely changes the trajectory. It creates a society in Al-Andalus and those surrounding frontier zones where you had centuries of daily, really intimate contact.
Wow.
For roughly 800 years, you had spoken Romance varieties, Arabic and Hebrew, all just rubbing up against each other.
That's a long time.
It's an incredibly long time.
Yeah.
You had a linguistic frontier that was not a solid wall, but like a highly permeable membrane.
Well, let me stop you there, because when we say intimate contact, what does that actually look like in the mechanics of the language?
Good question.
I know Arabic contributed thousands of words to Spanish, especially those words starting with al, right? Like almohada for pillow,
Yeah.
or algodon for cotton.
Yeah, lots of everyday nouns.
But did it actually change the way the language thinks, like its internal logic?
It did. It fundamentally altered the texture of the language. It wasn't just dropping new nouns into the dictionary to describe new things. It influenced expressions, idioms, and agricultural terminology. It introduced this wholly new level of poetic expressiveness.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Well, think of the Spanish word ojalá. It's used constantly to express hope, right? Like, I hope it rains, or I hope they arrive.
Right. Ojalá.
That comes directly from the Arabic law, Sha Allah, which means if God wills it.
Wait, really?
Yeah, so the spiritual and emotional posture of Arabic became physically embedded in the syntax of Spanish.
That is wild. So it's already this incredible linguistic survivor, right?
Yeah.
A mashup of Roman foundations, Germanic military terms, and centuries of heavy Arabic cultural and scientific context.
Exactly.
And then you have the long historical process of the Reconquista, slowly pushing the political power of the northern Christian kingdoms, specifically Castile southward.
Right, it was a very slow, grinding process.
Until the late 15th century. After the union of the major Iberian crowns, this specific Castilian variety rises up to become the dominant state language of Spain.
And 1492 is the absolute pivot point here.
Huge year.
Massive. The Reconquista ends with the fall of Granada. The very first grammar book of the Castilian language is published by Antonio de Nebrija.
Oh, wow.
And of course, Columbus sails across the Atlantic. This is the event that turns Spanish from just a regional European language into a truly global phenomenon.
Right, the expansion across the Americas. Now, I want to pause here because the research notes highlight a crucial concept: porosity.
Yes, porosity is key.
When Spanish arrived in Mexico, the Caribbean, Central and South America, and later parts of Africa and the Pacific, it was carried by empire, by missionization, by bureaucracy, and trade. But it did not simply operate as a blanket that smothered everything underneath it.
No, it didn't. If we look at the mechanics of that expansion, Spanish absorbed the local worlds it encountered. It was deeply porous.
Right.
The empire required communication to function, so Spanish was practically forced to stretch. It had to develop new vocabulary for entirely new ecosystems.
Animals and plants they had never seen before.
Exactly. New social structures and new spiritual concepts that literally did not exist in Europe.
Now, I want to make sure we impartially report on the tension highlighted in the sources here for you listening,
Yeah.
because it's a really profound paradox.
It is a huge paradox.
On one hand, the notes show Spanish as a vehicle of enormous literary beauty, right?
Yeah,
Shared identity and deep cultural connection.
absolutely.
But on the other hand, we have to look at what the history says. It was historically an instrument of colonization, empire, and massive cultural displacement.
Yeah, that's what the historical record clearly outlines.
The sources emphasize that modern Spanish speakers are navigating a history that includes the tragic loss of indigenous languages. But simultaneously, it involves an incredible, resilient process of cultural reinvention. We're just trying to convey the ideas contained in the original source material here, but it's a heavy tension.
That tension is undeniable in the research, and it is totally woven into the modern reality of the language. The populations of the Americas didn't just passively receive Spanish, they actively reshaped it. They injected their own syntax, their own phonetic rhythms, and their own worldview right into it.
And the result of all that mixing is staggering. The research cites data from the Instituto Cervantes, placing the total number of Spanish speakers worldwide at over 600 million.
Or 635 million if you include people actively learning it right now.
Over 600 million people. It's a continent-sized family.
It really is.
Reading through this history, it makes me think of Spanish as like an ancient, continuously inhabited city.
Oh, I like that.
Right. You walk down the street, and the foundations holding up the roads are Roman. But the walls of the buildings are Moorish, and the sweeping roofs and the vibrant paint jobs were added in South America.
Yeah, that's a perfect visual.
It really makes me wonder, though, does this mean there isn't really one Spanish language? Like, is it just hundreds of different regional histories wearing a trench coat, pretending to be one standardized language?
Well, the standardization is very real. I mean, a newspaper printed in Bogota is perfectly readable to someone sitting in a cafe in Madrid.
Okay, so the core remains intact.
Yes, but the regional souls of the language are wildly distinct. However, This historical porosity didn't just add new vocabulary, it fundamentally rewired the engine of the language.
The engine
Yeah.
itself.
To accommodate all these different peoples and concepts, the grammar had to become incredibly flexible.
Yeah.
And to truly see how that history translates into human thought, we have to look at the structural architecture.
Right, let's get into the mechanics of that architecture.
Sure.
At a basic level, the notes state that Spanish defaults to a subject-verb-object structure, or SVO,
Right.
which is the exact same as English. I see the house. Subject-verb-objects.
Right.
So on the surface, it looks super familiar, but the research emphasizes that Spanish is vastly more flexible than English. Why is that?
The flexibility comes entirely from the verbs. In English, our verbs are actually relatively weak when it comes to carrying information.
Weak. How so?
Well, if I just say the word speak, you have absolutely no idea who is speaking. I have to explicitly say I speak, or they speak, or we speak.
Right, the subject pronoun is mandatory.
Because English lost most of its complex verb endings over the centuries, it became highly dependent on a very rigid word order to make any sense.
But Spanish held on to that dense Latin inflection.
Precisely. Spanish verbs are like tightly packed little data files.
Data files, I like that.
A single verb form encodes the person, the number, the tense, the mood, and sometimes even the social stance of the speaker.
So if I say hablo, that single word already contains the I, the concept of speak, and the present tense.
Right.
And if I say hablaba, it contains the I, the concept of speak, and the continuous past tense.
Exactly. And because the verb does so much heavy lifting on its own, Spanish utilizes what linguists call the pro-drop mechanism.
Pro-drop.
Yeah, you can just drop the subject pronoun altogether. You don't need to explicitly name the doer of the action every single time. The action itself leads the thought.
Wow. If I'm forced to drop the subject and let the verb lead, it seems like my brain would become much more action-oriented, The event takes precedence over the ego of the speaker.
It absolutely does shift the cognitive focus.
And then, reading further into the grammar section here, there is an absolute mind-bender for English speakers.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
The split of the verb to be.
Yes. This is one of the deepest structural differences, and it has massive cognitive implications.
Okay, it is it.
Okay, so English has one all-purpose verb to cover existence. I am, you are, it is.
Right, just to be.
But Spanish splits this concept of existence into two entirely different verbs, ser and estar.
Okay, let's break this down mechanically. How do they function differently in daily speech?
Well, ser is derived from the Latin essus, and it is used to frame identity, essence, classification, or an inherent description. It's the core of what something fundamentally is.
Okay, essence.
Yeah.
Got it.
Estar, on the other hand, comes from the Latin stare, which meant to stand. It is used to frame state, circumstance, location, or condition in a specific context.
So in English, we say the apple is green and the apple is unripe.
Right.
It's the exact same word is. We don't distinguish the nature of the existence, but Spanish forces you to make a choice.
You have to choose. Is the apple green because it's a Granny Smith apple, meaning green is its inherent biological essence?
Right, it's always going to be green.
Exactly, that requires ser. La manzana es verde. Or is the apple green because it's simply not ripe yet, a temporary state that will eventually change to red?
Oh, I see.
That requires estar. La manzana está verde.
Let me push back on this a little, or rather, let me see if I can extrapolate this to human behavior.
Sure.
An apple is a simple object, but what happens when you apply this to a person?
That gets really interesting.
If I say he is boring versus he is bored in English, I'm using the same verb. Does Spanish force you to differentiate between someone's personality and their current mood?
Yes, it does, and it does so completely seamlessly. If you say es aburrido using ser, you are declaring that he is a fundamentally boring person. It is his essence.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's a permanent judgment. But if you say él está aburrido using estar, you are declaring that he is currently bored by his circumstances.
So what does that actually do to a person's brain over a lifetime?
That's the big question.
If I am constantly forced to choose between sir and a star, it seems like I would become hyper-aware of what is permanent versus what is temporary in my life and in my relationships.
The linguistic research posits exactly that. This constant grammatical nudging trains the speaker's attention toward relationship and stance.
Wow.
Reality isn't just a flat statement of fact. From childhood, a Spanish speaker is constantly, reflexively categorizing the world around them.
Just automatically.
Right. They are subconsciously asking, is this trait I'm about to describe permanent or temporary? Is this who someone is or just how they are acting right now? The speaker's analytical distance to reality is coded right into the very foundation of the sentence.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because the verbs do so much work, and because you are constantly evaluating states versus essences, the sentence structure doesn't have to be a rigid linear march like it often is in English.
Exactly.
The notes describe Spanish as building thought in waves of emphasis.
Yes, the rhetoric of Spanish is highly elastic. In English, if you want to emphasize a specific part of a sentence, you usually have to do it with the tone of your voice.
Because you can't easily change the word order without completely breaking the grammar.
Right. If I want to say, I haven't read that book, I'm pretty locked into that order. Subject, verb, object.
Yeah, if I want to emphasize the book, I just have to say the word louder. Like, I haven't read that book.
But in Spanish, the strong verb endings allow you to physically rearrange the sentence to match your emotional focus.
Oh, wow.
You can take the object, the thing you actually care about in the conversation, and front load it. You can say, ese libro no lo he leído. Literally, that book, I haven't read it.
It lets the emotional focus lead the sentence. The grammar actually bends to accommodate the speaker's priority.
It's wonderfully flexible.
And speaking of emotional focus, we have to talk about the subjunctive mood.
Oh, we absolutely do. The subjunctive is arguably the psychological crown jewel of the Spanish language.
I was reading this section of the notes and honestly struggling a bit at first. Let me see if I have this right.
Go for it.
English has traces of the subjunctive, like when we say, I demand that he be here, instead of he is here. But it's super rare. You're saying Spanish uses the subjunctive mood actively, constantly, every single day to mark desire, doubt, emotion, and uncertainty.
Yes. Let's look at the mechanics of it. In English, if I say, I know it rains versus I hope it rains, the verb rains doesn't change at all.
Right.
Your emotional stance, knowing versus hoping, has zero effect on the physical structure of the verb.
Okay, yes, the word rains is identical in both sentences.
But in Spanish, the actual structural skeleton of the verb mutates based on your emotional stance.
Wait, the verb itself changes.
Literally mutates. If you state a fact, I know it rains, you use the indicative mood, seco llueve.
Okay.
But the moment you introduce hope, doubt, fear, or uncertainty, I hope it rains, the verb literally changes its vowel ending to become llueva, espero que llueva.
Wow.
The language physically forces you to flag your uncertainty.
It's like a built-in emotional Instagram filter for reality.
Oh, I love that.
Like, you can't just take a raw, objective picture of the world with your words. The grammar forces you to apply a filter declaring your emotional stance toward that reality.
Exactly.
You have to constantly tell the listener, hey, this is a concrete fact, or hey, this is just a hope or a fear floating in my head.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it. It means uncertainty and desire aren't just side comments or extra words you add on. They are built into the load-bearing walls of the language.
That's incredible.
It makes Spanish exquisitely sensitive to possibility and to the inner life of the speaker.
When a language requires you to constantly calibrate your emotional distance through verbs and structurally forces you to declare your desires and doubts, the vocabulary inevitably evolves to match that hyper-awareness.
It has to, yeah.
Which brings us to the emotional lexicon of Spanish.
The vocabulary that notoriously defies simple one-to-one translation.
Exactly. The notes give us some fantastic examples of words that bundle incredibly complex social feelings into single, compact forms. Let's start with sobremesa.
Ah, sobremesa.
If you look it up in a cheap dictionary, it might just say after-dinner conversation, but the research emphasizes it is so much more than that.
Oh, it's completely different from just talking while digesting. Sobremesa is the cultural institution of shared, unhurried time.
Right.
It's the lingering at the table after a meal is entirely finished, when the plates are pushed aside and the conversation just drifts.
No rushing off to wash the dishes.
No agenda at all. It's a dedicated social space of presence that is so deeply valued by the culture, it required its own specific noun.
That sounds amazing. Then there's a word that comes up constantly in artistic contexts, duende.
Duende is fascinating. It is highly prevalent in artistic discourse, especially in southern Spain regarding flamenco music.
Mm-hmm.
The poet Federico Garcia Lorca famously tried to define it. It's often described as a dark, soulful, almost haunted force of expressive authenticity in a performance.
Wow, dark and haunted.
Yeah, it's not about technical perfection. It's that raw chill you get when an artist taps into something profound, tragic, and slightly dangerous. It is the physical manifestation of soul.
We also have querencia, which refers to a place or an attachment where one feels inwardly at home, emotionally rooted, and safe to draw strength from.
Beautiful word.
And then there's desahogo.
Yeah.
There's this concept of emotional release, of unburdening yourself,
Yeah.
getting something incredibly heavy off your chest so you can finally breathe.
Now, we must be careful here. There is a common trap in pop linguistics to say that these words are quote-unquote untranslatable because English speakers lack the emotional depth to understand them.
All right, I want to push back on that exact idea. Is it really that an English speaker doesn't feel the need for an emotional release like desahogo?
Not at all.
Or is it just that in English we use our tone of voice or a longer explanatory phrase like, I just needed to vent, instead of having one dedicated magical word for it?
You're exactly right to push back on that. It is absolutely not about English speakers lacking human feeling. What's fascinating here is how the languages assign real estate in the dictionary.
Real estate in the dictionary. Yeah.
Each of these Spanish words serves as a compact cultural form. They bundle a specific social expectation, a shared history, and a worldview into a single lexical unit.
They prioritize it.
Yes. Spanish treats these complex emotional spaces as important enough to institutionalize. Spanish tends to treat strong feeling as something to be performed and inhabited in the sentence itself, making the language feel emotionally immediate rather than merely descriptive.
If you, the listener, want a perfect example of how this emotional performance works in daily life, we have to look at diminutives.
Oh, yeah.
The little suffixes like ito or ita.
Diminutives are an absolute masterclass in emotional pragmatics.
In English, if we want to express that something is small, we just add an adjective, right? Say little dog or small coffee.
Right.
But in Spanish, you physically alter the noun. You add ito to make pero into parito, or café into cafecito. But reading through the research, this is absolutely not just about physical size, is it?
Physical size is only the very, very surface layer. Diminutives are primarily used to scale the emotional temperature of conversation.
The emotional temperature.
Let's look at the mechanics. Adding ito or ita can signal affection or tenderness, sure, but it can also be used strategically to soften a harsh statement.
Oh, like a cushion.
Exactly, to negotiate a favor, or even to deploy intense passive aggression depending entirely on the context and the speaker's tone.
So think about how incredibly useful this would be in your daily life. If you're in a tense business negotiation, or maybe a minor argument with your spouse, instead of trying to find the perfect, polite English sentence to de-escalate the situation, Spanish allows you to just attach 3 letters to the end of a noun to instantly lower the temperature of the room.
It's incredibly efficient.
You can take a demand like un momento, a moment, and turn it into a gentle plea. Un momentito. It's just a tiny little moment, please.
The speaker is constantly actively tuning the interpersonal distance between themselves and the listener.
Yeah.
And when a language has such clear, emotionally packed words and such a rhythmically flexible grammar, it inevitably creates a feedback loop. The structure of the language dictates the art, the diet, and the daily rhythm of the people who speak it.
Let's look at the literal sound of it first, because the acoustic reality of Spanish is totally unique. The notes describe Spanish as having a relatively simple but incredibly stable vowel system.
Yes, Spanish has 5 pure vowels, A, E, I, O, U, and they are exceptionally crisp.
Unlike English.
Very unlike English. English has anywhere from 14 to 20 different vowel sounds, depending on the dialect, and we rely heavily on diphthongs.
Diphthongs, that's where the vowel sound glides and changes halfway through, right?
Right, like the O in boat. But Spanish vowels do not move, they are cleanly articulated, and the syllables are very stable.
And what does that mean mechanically? If my vowels are pure and stable, what does my language sound like to a foreigner?
It creates a rolling, percussive, rhythmic momentum. Because the vowels are open and the stress patterns are highly regular, the language sits beautifully on melody and repetition.
Right.
This gives it massive musical elasticity.
Which perfectly explains why Spanish is an absolute powerhouse for global music.
Oh, without a doubt.
It's a perfect vehicle for entirely different genres. It can carry the deep, acoustic, tragic sorrow of traditional flamenco.
Right.
It can carry the lush, romantic, sweeping melodies of a Mexican bolero. And it naturally supports the intense, fast, syncopated drive of Caribbean salsa and modern reggaeton.
The sound system makes it really easy to sustain flowing vocal lines and execute rapid internal rhymes. The language often sounds like it already possesses a built-in kinetic energy. It expects movement.
And this expressiveness, this kinetic energy, bleeds right into the language of food. The culinary vocabulary in the notes is basically a map of the language's entire history.
It is a perfect historical archive. In Spain, the food vocabulary carries the traces of Mediterranean agriculture and deep Arab influence.
Okay, like what words?
Words for olive oil, aceite, olives, aceitunas, and sugar, azúcar. Those are overwhelmingly Arabic in origin.
Wow.
But then, when Spanish crossed the Atlantic, the Americas completely transformed the pantry.
The indigenous cross-pollination.
Yes, exactly. The language absorbed entirely new local ecologies. Words originating from indigenous languages like maíz for corn from Taíno,
Right.
or cacao, tomate, and aguacate for avocado from Nahuatl in Mexico. These didn't just enter the Spanish dictionary, they entered global culture through the Spanish language.
And tying it back to our earlier concept of sobremesa, the research notes that food in Spanish isn't framed merely as caloric fuel intake.
No, not at all.
The vocabulary frames food as kinship, memory, and timing. The sociality is baked right into the very words you use to pass the bread.
Yeah.
It's a deeply physical relationship to the world, which actually brings us to the idioms.
Everyday Spanish idioms are incredibly bodily and spatial.
I found these examples fascinating because they don't rely on abstract logic. They rely on immediate physical sensations,
Right.
like the phrase estar en la luna.
Literally to be on the moon.
Right. It means to be absent-minded or daydreaming.
Or?
No, tener pelos en la lengua, to have no hairs on the tongue, which means, to speak bluntly, to be totally unfiltered.
That's a great one.
But my absolute favorite is ahogarse en un vaso de agua, drowning in a glass of water.
Notice how dramatic that is.
It's a wildly cinematic way to say someone is overreacting to a very small problem.
But look at the mechanism behind it. These idioms are deeply visual. They rely on images you can instantly feel in your body. A hair on your tongue. The sheer panic of drowning.
You feel it.
You do. It points to a storytelling culture that prioritizes cadence, build-up, and emotional framing over stark efficiency.
Reading the analysis on storytelling, give me this analogy. Communicating in English often feels like riding a commuter bullet train.
Okay, a bullet train.
Yeah, the entire goal of an English sentence is usually efficiency. Get to the point, deliver the data, arrive at the destination on time.
Right.
But Spanish storytelling operates more like a scenic road trip. The detours, the scene setting, the dramatic mimicry, the emotional buildup, that's not considered inefficiency. That is the point of the trip.
And returning to the grammar for a second, the syntax actually supports that scenic road trip.
How so?
Well, because Spanish uses gendered nouns, robust verb conjugations, and clear relative pronouns, the language tolerates long, flowing sentences with multiple nested clauses very well.
So you don't get lost as easily.
Right. A speaker can drift away from the main point, add 3 descriptive details, and circle back without the sentence collapsing under its own structural weight. The listener never loses track of who is doing what, because the verb endings keep the map clear.
But if we're going to talk about this scenic road trip, we have to acknowledge that the trip sounds fundamentally different depending on where in the world you are driving.
Oh, completely different.
This language is stretched across 600 million people. How does it survive that kind of geographical vastness without fracturing into a dozen completely different languages?
That is the ultimate mystery of Spanish. It has maintained massive mutual intelligibility while simultaneously developing intense regional variation. And those lines of variation carry profound social, historical, and demographic weight. Let's look at the mechanics of just a few major phonetic boundaries, starting with Spain.
Right. The dialect of central and northern Spain is famous for what people often mistakenly call a lisp.
It is absolutely not a lisp. It's a phonetic phenomenon called distinction. Yes. In standard European Spanish, the E sound is pronounced like an English S. But the Z and the C, one followed by an E or I, are pronounced with the sound.
Okay, give me an example.
The word for hunt, casa, sounds like caza, while the word for house, casa, sounds like casa. They are distinct phonemes.
There's an old myth that a Spanish king had a lisp and the whole court copied him to be polite, and that's how the language changed. The notes completely debunk that. It was just a natural phonetic shift in the 16th century.
Exactly. It was a chaotic realignment of sibilant sounds in Castile. But crucially, the ports in southern Spain, in Andalusia, where the ships left for the Americas, they didn't adopt this distinction.
Oh, they merged the sounds.
Right. And that is exactly why Latin America largely pronounces casa and casa the exact same way today.
So let's look at the Americas. Mexico has a huge cultural weight globally due to media, dubbing, and sheer population size. What are the mechanics of Mexican Spanish?
Central Mexican Spanish often features very clear, fully pronounced consonants, but culturally it has a deep indigenous lexical influence, particularly from Nahuatl.
Right.
It is also famous for an extensive, incredibly pragmatic use of diminutives. In Mexico, you don't just use ito for nouns, you actually attach it to adverbs.
To adverbs.
Yeah. Ahorita, which means right now, or despacito, meaning slowly. It is a mechanism to soften requests, avoid direct confrontation, and continuously negotiate extreme politeness.
And then you go way down south to Argentina and Uruguay, the Rio de la Plata region. This dialect always sounds so wildly different to my ear.
That is the Rio Platense dialect. The defining grammatical feature is the voceo. They use the pronoun vos instead of tu for the informal you, which comes with its own unique verb conjugations.
Okay, but acoustically, what you are hearing is the intonation.
Yes.
Sounds almost Italian.
Because historically, it practically is.
Yeah.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Buenos Aires received a massive influx of Italian immigrants. That demographic wave was so overwhelming that the melodic contour, the rise and fall of the pitch in a sentence, was permanently altered. It gave Argentine Spanish this dramatic, theatrical cadence that is instantly recognizable.
And then you swing up to the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and the coastal areas of Colombia and Venezuela.
Caribbean Spanish is shaped by its tropical climate, its port city history, and intense historical contact with African languages and indigenous Taíno. Mechanically, it is some of the fastest and most rhythmically compressed Spanish in the world.
The notes mention the dropping of the S. What does that actually sound like?
It's a process called debuccalization. The final S on a word isn't pronounced crisply. It's softened into an aspirated H sound or dropped entirely.
Oh, I see.
So los amigos becomes lo mingo. Combined with a fast syllabic flow, this creates a percussive, syncopated rhythm that feels musically propelled.
And these variations aren't just fun acoustic trivia either. They encode complex social hierarchies. The notes spend a lot of time analyzing the pronouns of address. Tu, usted, and vos.
This is a critical psychological difference from English. In modern English, we just have you.
Right.
Whether I am talking to a judge, my mother, or a dog, I say you. We rely entirely on our tone of voice and our vocabulary to establish respect or intimacy.
But Spanish forces you to grammatically declare the social distance between you and the listener?
Yes. Tu and vos are informal, used for friends, peers, and children. Usted is formal, used for elders, authorities, or strangers.
But looking at the sociological notes, it's not a simple binary of cold versus warm, is it?
Not at all. And this is a massive revelation for many learners. In many families, particularly in rural areas or specific countries like Colombia or Costa Rica, children address their parents and grandparents using the formal usted.
Which to an outsider might sound distant.
Exactly, but it is not because there is an emotional distance or a lack of love. It is because deep, profound affection and absolute respect are perfectly coexisting in that word. The language trains speakers to constantly track intimacy, age, and social setting and to honor it grammatically.
But there is also a darker tension here between prestige dialects and stigmatized varieties.
Yes. As in any global language, power dictates perception. The varieties associated with educated open centers or historical institutions like Madrid, Mexico City, or Bogota traditionally gained prestige.
Yeah, they were the voices and the news anchors.
Right, the universities, the media. Conversely, varieties that preserved rural patterns or were linked to racialized populations or poverty were often unfairly stigmatized as quote-unquote incorrect Spanish. The notes phrase the reality brilliantly. Dialect is identity worn through the mouth.
If dialect is identity, how does globalization affect a language this massive? The research indicates that Spanish is currently mutating in two completely opposite directions at the exact same time.
It really is.
It's being pulled apart and pushed together simultaneously.
This raises an important question about the future of the language. On one hand, mass media, global publishing, streaming platforms, and the explosion of transnational Latin pop music are creating a shared, mutually legible standard. A teenager in Spain and a teenager in Chile are listening to the exact same Puerto Rican artist and watching the exact same Mexican television show. They understand each other's slang better than any generation before them.
But on the other hand, local identity remains incredibly stubborn. The internet, Social media and vast migration patterns are producing powerful, new hybrid identities.
Absolutely.
You have the rapid evolution of U.S. border Spanish, blending English syntax with Spanish vocabulary in totally novel ways. You have digitally accelerated urban slang in major cities.
Right.
Think about what that actually feels like. Imagine sharing a native language with 600 million people across dozens of countries, being able to stream a show from Madrid or read a novel from Lima, and yet feeling this intense, fiercely protective pride over the specific way your tiny neighborhood in Buenos Aires or San Juan pronounces a single consonant.
It's amazing.
It's a simultaneous feeling of massive global belonging and hyper-local tribal identity.
It is a constant daily negotiation between shared intelligibility and regional pride. And to truly understand this identity, to really see the boundaries of what the Spanish mental world simulation is, we have to look at it in comparison.
Right.
We need a mirror. The sources provide two. First, we'll compare Spanish to a distant cultural cousin, English, and then to its immediate sibling on the Iberian Peninsula, Portuguese.
Let's start with English. The contrast is incredibly sharp. We touched on this with the bullet train storytelling analogy, but modern American English has a deep structural preference for directness, efficiency, and linearity.
Yes. If we look at the sociolinguistics, English often treats strong, unchecked emotion as something that impedes clear communication.
Yeah.
It is a language heavily influenced by a history of commerce, industrialization, and Protestant pragmatism. It often feels like a language of control.
Interesting.
Spanish, conversely, has a remarkably high tolerance for rhetorical buildup, for conversational drift, and for what the researchers call elastic social time.
So what does this all mean for how we actually argue and persuade? If I'm trying to convince you of something in English versus Spanish, how does this strategy change?
Well, English arguments heavily reward linearity. State your point, provide the evidence, deliver the conclusion. Logic is the primary, unquestioned tool.
Right. Keep it clean.
Exactly. Spanish discourse, however, permits and even expects more circling, more contextual framing. Persuasion in Spanish comes not only from raw logic, but from cadence, from building a relationship, and from establishing emotional credibility with the listener before delivering the conclusion.
So the delivery matters just as much.
Totally. Directness in Spanish is often cushioned socially. A blunt English demand translated literally into Spanish can sound incredibly rude because Spanish manages directness through tone, diminutives, and warmth, rather than stripped-down wording.
So to summarize that philosophical difference, English says state the thing clearly. Spanish says live the thing while saying it.
That is the perfect distillation. Now, let's look at its closest geographical sibling, Portuguese. They are siblings, but they are absolutely not twins.
Right. They both came from the exact same Vulgar Latin spoken by the Roman soldiers on the Iberian Peninsula. So mechanically, where did the split happen?
It was a geographical and political split following the collapse of Roman rule. Portuguese grew out of a specific linguistic pocket in the northwest of the peninsula, known as the Galician Portuguese Continuum.
Good.
Castilian Spanish, meanwhile, rose in the central, eastern, and southern regions. As Portugal consolidated its borders as its own independent kingdom and began its own global expansion, its language followed its own distinct evolutionary path.
And if you look at them on paper, they share a massive amount of deep architecture. They both use gendered nouns. They both have incredibly rich verb conjugations. They both drop the subject pronoun, and they share an enormous amount of vocabulary. If you know Spanish, you can read a Portuguese newspaper and understand the gist of it pretty well. But the sound, the acoustic and emotional experience of hearing the two spoken aloud is unbelievably different.
The clearest contrast is phonetic, and it comes down to the mechanics of the mouth. As we discussed, Spanish projects its syllables very cleanly.
Right, the 5 vowels.
The vowels are stable, you open your mouth, and the sound projects outward. It's percussive. Portuguese, especially European Portuguese, features intense vowel reduction.
What is the physical mechanism of vowel reduction?
In unstressed syllables, a Portuguese speaker keeps their mouth more closed, the vowels are swallowed, and the sound is frequently diverted up into the nasal cavity.
Oh, wow.
This blends the consonants together. Instead of crisp, separate syllables, you get this hushed, gliding, continuous texture. It physically traps the sound, which creates an acoustic atmosphere that feels incredibly inward.
I love the analogy the notes use for this. Spanish says things with the lights on. Portuguese says them in twilight.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
And now I understand why. Because the Portuguese speaker is literally keeping the sound internalized and nasalized. It sounds like twilight. Whereas the Spanish speaker has their mouth wide open, projecting stable vowels into the room, lights on.
It's a perfect description of the acoustic atmosphere.
Yes.
And this phonetic reality dictates their musical outputs, just like we saw earlier.
Right. You have the punchy, crisp, outward percussive strikes of Spanish salsa and flamenco. It strikes the ear.
Yes.
And then you have the floating, liquid, melancholic atmosphere of Portuguese fado and Brazilian bossa nova. It lingers in the ear.
And their modern global shapes are profoundly different, too. Spanish is multi-centered. It has massive hubs of cultural gravity in Madrid, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Bogota, and Los Angeles.
Very decentralized.
Right. Portuguese is heavily anchored by one absolutely massive demographic powerhouse, Brazil. The sheer population of Brazil creates a completely different sociolinguistic gravity for the Portuguese language compared to the decentralized nature of Spanish.
Listening to this comparison, I picture Spanish as the bright, radiant, incredibly expressive extrovert, holding court at a dramatic dinner party, telling a story with their hands, prioritizing connection and warmth.
Oh, definitely.
And Portuguese is the deeply introspective, poetic sibling sitting out on the balcony in the twilight, enveloped in mood, nostalgia, and atmosphere. Same historical family, completely different weather.
It is a dense, beautiful architecture to explore.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. From the boots of Roman soldiers and the Arabic poetry of Al-Andalus, to the stark logic of Sir and Estar, all the way to the twilight sounds of Portuguese and the modern mutation of dialects.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
But to bring this all together for you listening, when the researchers talk about thinking in Spanish, they aren't talking about a strict magical linguistic determinism where your brain is hijacked and you lose your free will.
Right, it's not mind control.
Exactly. Rather, it is about inhabiting a language where speech is relational before it is informational. It is an invitation to constantly tune your interpersonal distance, to externalize your warmth through grammar, and to experience time not as a rigid mechanical schedule, but as a human atmosphere. It's a language that gives you permission to be visibly, emotionally alive in your speech.
So here is our call to action for you today. Take a moment and really observe your own native language.
Yeah.
Notice the invisible rules you follow every time you open your mouth. How does your language force you to prioritize information? Does your grammar make you hide your emotional stance behind just the facts? Or does it give you the built-in tools to perform your emotions in every sentence?
And that leaves us with a fascinating, slightly haunting question to ponder, built directly on the research we covered today.
If a language like Spanish provides ready-made grammatical channels for warmth, vulnerability, and dramatic intensity, what versions of our own personalities remain completely dormant and hidden simply because our native language hasn't given us the vocabulary or the syntax to let them out?
Imagine waking up tomorrow and a new grammar suddenly allowed you to be a version of yourself you didn't even know existed. We'll leave you to translate that for yourselves. Until next time.